Hi, everybody. My name's Brad Kelly, and I am the regional coordinator for the Society of Biblical Literature's Pacific Coast region. And I want to welcome you to this installment of this year's SBL Pacific Coast Regional Meeting that we're calling K-Ray and Kativ, Read and Written. Obviously, things are a little different this year with the pandemic, so some of our papers are coming to you as video recordings. And I'm excited about this paper. Today we have a paper by Dr. Jessica Tinklenberg from the Claremont College's Center for Teaching and Learning. This is a paper from our program unit entitled Teaching Biblical Studies. This is our pedagogy program unit at the regional meeting. And so the format will be the paper will go for about 20 minutes. And then at the end of that, the two chairpersons of that program unit, Dr. Carl Toney, Dr. Christopher Hurd, will interact just a little bit with our presenter before we wrap things up. So without further delay, let me turn it over to Jessica Tinklenberg. And the title of her paper is Anti-Racist Pedagogies for the Biblical Studies Classroom. If you would, please.
Hi, thanks so much for letting me join you all today. I am looking forward to it. I'm going to share my screen, as we always say when we Zoom things. There we go. Again, thanks so much for letting me be here with you all today. I just wanted to go over sort of how I'm envisioning this 20 minutes together goes. I'm hoping that those of you that are watching the recording will see some spaces where there are questions, where you can pause the recording and think about those questions and not try to race through the whole video in one go, because there are some difficult questions in there, some things that might challenge the way you've been thinking about your classroom. And so I just want to give you space to do that. I also want to let folks that are watching know that you don't have to try to do all these things. Every effort we make is an effort toward dismantling racism in the classroom. And so maybe thinking about one or two changes you can make to your classroom now or in the near future, that will get you started and maybe stave off some anxiety about trying to do everything in order to be successful. So as mentioned, I'm Jessica. I'm the program director of the Claremont College's Center for Teaching and Learning. Before that, I was a biblical studies professor for 10 years at Morningside College in Sioux City, Iowa. And my PhD work is in religions of Western antiquity from Florida State. So what I want to start with is this great definition that I think really encapsulates what we mean by what anti-racism looks like in the classroom. And that's really what we're going to focus on today, is what it looks like in a biblical studies or religious studies classroom. This definition is from Condon and Young, and actually they write this book, Performing Anti-Racist Pedagogy, about writing studies classrooms. But I think that the definition that they offer and the way they talk about what anti-racism is going to be useful to us in biblical studies as well. Each of these highlighted sections, I'm going to pull out for us and then talk through some questions that maybe will help us understand what that aspect of the definition means, and then how we can maybe apply it to particular aspects of the biblical studies classroom in particular. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading this whole thing, because we're going to get to all these pieces as we go through the day today, through our 20 minutes today. But just really to focus in particular on understanding that what we're talking about here is how can we dismantle structures, racist structures and practices that impede the ability to succeed for some or most of our students and center whiteness. So we really want to decenter whiteness, those white and think about how we can center the actual students we have and attend to the real students that are in our classrooms and the ways that race and racism impact their ability to be successful. So we're going to walk through each of these today. We're going to start with this one. The anti-racist classroom offers an understanding or explanation of race, racism, and particular racial formations that develop in and around the class program. And here what we're really saying is that the anti-racist classroom makes race a part of, makes understanding race, explaining racism a part of every part, every aspect of the classroom, because it is a structural feature in so much of our classrooms. We don't try to hide, we're transparent about race and the way racism has played a role in our classrooms. And we don't try to hide whiteness and what that means in the classroom by not discussing the ways whiteness impacts our classroom as well, right? That is, it's not just talking about race as blackness or brownness, but as whiteness as well, and the ways that whiteness comes into our classroom, and really being transparent with our students about race and racism and the way that race comes into everything that we do in the classroom, not just on certain days where we say, oh, now we're going to talk about a Black author. That's not the only day that we want to talk about race in the classroom. That's not the only day we want to explain racism in the classroom. So how might we do this? A couple things that we should ask ourselves. And again, at any point, if you would rather pause this recording and think about these questions, you're certainly welcome to do that. But one way we might think about this in a biblical studies classroom is we might want to think about whose voices have historically counted in academic biblical studies. And by that, I mean who maybe is on your syllabus reading list and has been for years and years because they were on your grad school professor's reading list and had been passed down, right? These are voices that we've historically said count in biblical studies, but that maybe are centering only one kind of voice, right? We count white, male, European voices in biblical studies disproportionate to the ways that we count, that we include the voices of women, minoritized populations, Black and Brown scholars, and Black and Brown communities as well. So if we think about these questions about who is historically counted and whose voices are on your syllabus reading list, if we're going to make race a transparent part of the biblical studies classroom, then we have to start talking about why we've allowed those voices to be centered, why we've allowed those voices to dominate our reading lists, and how we can bring in dissent, critique, counter voices, other communities' voices to recenter. That is, it doesn't mean that you have to get rid of all the white scholars in your class in order to be successful. But it does mean that we have got to reframe the conversation so that those white voices and white authors aren't the only ones seen as representative scholarship, right? That is, hey, when we only have white voices in our classroom, of course, that makes whiteness invisible, right? As if it's the only way to be a scholar. And it doesn't make transparent the way race played a role in their ability to be counted in academic biblical studies. This is about the concept of transparency. We know that transparency, being transparent about the why behind things we do in the classroom, and what it means, the purpose and the criteria that behind what we're doing in the classroom, those acts have a real power. That transparency has a real power to encourage and support the equitable experience of our Black and Brown students. Transparency is actually a critical tool to this process of dismantling invisible whiteness in the classroom. So that's the first thing I would encourage, is that we all think about the why behind who counts in our biblical studies classrooms. The second aspect of that definition that I gave you at the beginning is that the anti-racist classroom defines and explains the particular realms of experience that both individuals and groups find themselves involved in at that site or classroom. I think that we know, maybe, but don't attend to the fact that our students are not disembodied brains in our classroom. They come from places, they come from experiences, they come from communities, and those realms of experience impact who they are in the classroom. Of course, this is true of us too. We have realms of experience, we have communities, we have backgrounds, and those impact the way that we form the biblical studies classroom. And Unfortunately, a racist classroom very often foregrounds only one kind or realm of experience. And an anti-racist classroom really wants to understand multiple realms of experience that individuals, groups, or communities find themselves in when they come into the classroom. So how might we do this? We might want to ask ourselves which communities' interpretive methods and values we explicitly discuss in our course. Why do we pick those particular interpretive methods? Why do we pick those particular values? And then what do our students bring into the religious studies classroom? I think that we've all had the experience in biblical studies of a student who thinks they don't need to take the course because they read the Bible in Sunday school. And that is one frame of reference, right? Our students approach our classroom from only understanding the Bible from the faith tradition. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. But if you can get them to express what that meant, what it looked like, how that community interpreted the text, then those means of approach can actually inform the conversation and can really inform how you go from there. One of the most revealing things I've ever done as a biblical studies instructor is on the very first day of class, say, what previous experience do you have with the Bible or the New Testament or the Gospels or whatever I happen to be teaching, and just let them talk about it. And then by having that information, it shows that I value those communities of origin. I value those experiences. I want to draw on them. Now, that doesn't mean that we allow students to just stay in that particular interpretive mode. Obviously, we want to open them up, expand their means of approach. But hopefully, by just even saying, I value your experience, we are recognizing, we're defining that there are multiple ways of coming at the text. And for communities of color, that can be incredibly powerful experience to know that my experience, my community, my way of coming to this particular place at this particular time is going to be seen and valued in this text. And obviously this is about representation. Whose values do we explicitly reference and represent in our course? Whose means of approach? Whose interpretive methods, even when they might be discomforting to us, right? So that's a second place we could maybe make our classrooms more anti-racist, is to invite more realms of experience into our classrooms. The third one is a bit hard. The third one, remember I said earlier that being anti-racist classroom is about dismantling structures, right? And one of those structures that we have great historical evidence is racist is grading structures, grading mechanisms, feedback mechanisms, the ways that schools admit students. A short aside, we saw that in the UC system this year, that by removing that high stakes testing, our students were better able to, more students were better able to apply to the UCs, and we got a great increase in minoritized student applications. All of these are part of racist structures that create artificial barriers to student success. And so we have to think structurally about grading and the values and the mechanisms for grading in our classrooms. So how might we do that? In the biblical studies classroom, we might want to think about where we developed a structure of what considers proper writing and speaking. And then of course, what we consider proper grades for things, right? When I talk about proper forms of writing and speaking, I'm talking about culturally sustaining practices. Culturally sustaining practices were first discussed by Django Paris and some of his colleagues as a way to think about the languages, the speaking, the communication practices of the communities that come into our classroom. And rather than saying that doesn't have any value here, say that has great value here, and we want to sustain that and nurture it and have you use that as a tool to communicate maybe to different communities. So in terms of writing and speaking, we might want to talk with our students who write and speak a lot already, right, before they come to our class. We might want to ask them to think about what audience they're speaking to, what their tone is, what their argument already is. Show that we value those things, and then help them use those rhetorical tools to expand their sense of writing and speaking. We may also want to, in the biblical studies classroom, think about ways to grade and or not grade our students beyond the sort of exegetical paper approach, right? That there can be other ways that students can show they know what they've learned in your class, that they can be successful in the class beyond that very narrow definition of what is proper writing or speaking in the biblical studies classroom. And the other thing in terms of how racism plays a role in classroom structures is, of course, the mechanisms we use for grading. We might want to involve and engage our students, all our students, in that process of deciding how things get graded, and if they do, and how the students can show what they know. It's another way we show that they value. So if I'm sitting in a dark room by myself, talking about grading, writing down the rubric all by my lonesome, I'm thinking about what I value and not what the community brings to the classroom, right? And then it's more likely that my own biases, my own preconceptions about what's proper or appropriate might get involved there in ways that could disadvantage particular students. So we want to be culturally sustaining. We don't want to just say, oh, you spoke that way, you wrote that way before, but now you're going to do this. We want to say, we value what you bring into the classroom, and we're going to use it in meaningful ways so that we can all show that we've learned. The next piece of that definition is that the anti-racist classroom explains the particular brands of whiteness and whiteliness that occur in the classroom and in assessments. By brands of whiteness, I think here the authors mean the different manifestations of whiteness and whiteliness in a classroom. That is, racism is not always just horrific, offensive comments, right? There are other ways that whiteliness, white supremacy enters into our classroom practices. On this next slide, now I'm going to give you a whole bunch of them. Feel free to just sort of, again, pause and scan and to think about the ways that these might be examples of whiteness, white supremacy that maybe don't involve racial slurs, for example, but are still just as insidious and causing our students harm. So I want to think about this in terms of, again, classroom assignments and assessments, like we were talking about grading in the last piece. And really what I want to focus on is, do your assignments and assessments value learning in the course or something else? And here's a good example. I used to give time tests in some of my intro classes. Time tests don't value student learning, right? They prize instead the fastest, most well-prepared, the ones for whom English is their first language and they've been practicing it, right? It might benefit the most competitive, right? It sees students as adversaries where I have to, be sitting there with my stopwatch. Go, now stop. That's all the time you have, right? And that these aren't necessarily like overt racist statements that I'm making, but they do very clearly show I value a particular kind of teaching structure, a particular kind of classroom and its assessments. And it doesn't show that I value student learning in the course. So I tried to move away from, and I'm hoping that maybe we'll be encouraged to move away from actually valuing speed or a particular kind of white grammar or colonizer language, patriarchal language, competition, adversarial views of students. These are all sort of a part of this whiteliness that can come into our classrooms in ways that we may not even have recognized. And part of that too is because we've been very successful. And so in these structures, right, in these structures of whiteness and whiteliness. And so we forget that they actually are not necessary for students to show their learning. So how can we move our assignments and assessments from these not relevant factors, right, where we're only giving the possibility for success to certain kinds of students with certain kinds of capacities and certain kinds of cultural backgrounds, and making it more possible for all our students to show that they've learned. This is a concept from assessment called construct validity. Really, the idea here is make sure that your assignments and assessments are set up to evaluate and value what you actually want to know about, right? What you actually, in our case, what a student has learned in the course, and that it's not trying to value or evaluate things that are not at all relevant factors, right? Like your access to white culture or your access to speed, right, in processing. So that's a lot to think about, I understand, but maybe be thinking about ways that whiteness, white supremacy get into our classrooms in ways that aren't overtly about language or racism in the way we sometimes thought about it. And then the very last one is my favorite and also probably the hardest, that in the anti-racist classroom, in anti-racist work generally, it's important that everyone feels safe, but it's equally important that many feel uncomfortable. And I want to talk about this one in terms of how this might impact our white students. If we say that we are going to be centering minoritized voices, if we say that we're going to be centering minoritized scholars, that we're going to work on representation and transparency, it is possible that some of our students will take that discomfort as if it were a threat. And I think that it's really important at those points, if we have established trusting relationships where everyone does feel safe, to say that your discomfort that you're feeling just a little bit of right now is nothing compared to the harms that our students of color are managing and living with often on a daily basis, and types of trauma that have built up over their educational past. Here we might be talking about stuff like stereotype threat, imposter syndrome, racial battle fatigue. Our BIPOC students very often live in spaces where they're dealing with that more than discomfort, that trauma, that harm every day. And so it's really important to speak to our white students at that point and say, just remember that your discomfort is not the same as threat or trauma. There are many ways that your discomfort is really just about how you always felt comfortable. And that caused pain and hurt to many of our other students. So we might want to ask ourselves in this case, which of our students might feel comfortable with our current class because it conforms to them always having been centered in the class, right? Which of our teachers, TAs, our administrators, ourselves might feel the most comfortable because it's the way that it's always been for them, right? And then to take that next step and say, if these people are comfortable, who then is that making always entirely uncomfortable to the point where we're doing harm, where we're inflicting and re-inflicting racist trauma? And so then to recenter, and we've been talking about this all the way through, to recenter some voices that might have always felt minoritized or left out or devalued, and to push some of our students who might have always felt comfortable in their previous education to experience discomfort so that they can understand just a tiny piece of what it might feel like to not always be the center of any discussion. So those are the 5 pieces that I think we can work on to better encourage an anti-racist classroom. Again, these are about dismantling structures, and I know that makes it more difficult. It's not about feelings or anything, but really about how we dismantle structures and practices. So I hope that you'll have a chance to choose 1 or 2 of those to work on in the coming days, weeks, and months. I would love to hear from you if you do. This is my contact information. And if this is something that you've decided to work on, it would be so great if you wanted to reach out to me and we could talk about how that's going for you and what kinds of things you're learning from your anti-racist classroom practice. Which brings me to the end of the formal presentation. I'm looking forward to the questions from my colleagues. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much for that. And let me go ahead and kind of bring us back in. And I think, Carl, why don't we come to you first?
Thank you so much for that thought-provoking presentation. Appreciate your time and energy that you put into that. When I think about my own pedagogical practices, one of the things that I've prioritized in my classroom has been encouraging students to use gender-inclusive language. But as I reflect upon that, I wonder if my insistence on that language is actually something that could be part of the structures and mechanics of grading that is actually could be potentially harmful. So, does it end up proving to challenge structures of racism when I say use inclusive language, or am I actually concealing them? So in the biblical studies, New Testament, if I want to translate the Bible, I'll use something like the NRSV that uses inclusive language. But the reality is that is a text that's a brown perspective text that I now have imported inclusive language upon. And then I do that with some of my students. So I'm wondering, how can I use language of inclusion to raise up some awareness when it comes to these sort of anti-racial themes and ideas?
Yeah, I mean, what a fascinating sort of intersection of two of our very deep concerns in biblical studies right now, right? And I appreciate you bringing that question up. I think that issue, the first section on transparency, I think is really helpful here. It may not solve all our problems, but if you say, I recognize that the pronouns in this text or the gender language in this text has been made to be more inclusive in these ways. And I just want to share that with you so that you know that. The translators made that decision for these reasons. That's the why question in transparency. And then say, on the other hand, it hides some aspects of culture and of language that may be important to some communities, that may be important to some ways of thinking about God or humanity or whatever we want to give gender to. And so just making sure that in any case that we're not hiding it, because it's that act of wiping it away, right? That is the real problem. And transparency allows us to really say, this is the why behind the what. And we know that acts of transparency like that, one, let students know that we think that they are thoughtful and bright and can handle difficult multiple concepts at the same time. And two, that we want to invite them into that conversation, right? So then ask them, so, what do we gain and what do we lose here? Who might this benefit and who might this minoritize, right? So just inviting your students into being part of that conversation, I think through transparency could help. I hope that helps.
Thanks.
You bet.
Thank you. Chris, please.
Well, there are so many different things that I would want to ask right now. And I think out of the menu of choices, I will go to a question that overlaps a little bit with Carl's. And in terms of your presentation, I think sort of sits mostly near the end with the idea of needing to make some people uncomfortable. The question in short is, what value is there in promoting anti-racism in our own classes and society, in teaching directly about implicit bias, systemic racism in our guild, and part B, in the ancient world, because we are teaching texts that have their own issues in terms of a bias. There's certainly along, not so much perhaps along color lines as we would see in the modern world, but when I'm teaching the ancient Israelite perspective on Philistines, or something like that, or you even have these very insulting stories about Moabites and Ammonites and that sort of thing. Um, so the question is kind of two-part. You've got the teaching about the um, biases of the ancient world, and I'm wondering, does that have value for us combating racism in our own world? And secondly, the B part is teaching about the structural biases and implicit racism in our own guild. And I'm thinking here about things like the very pervasive tendency in modern scholarship to whitewash Egypt, to treat Egypt as if it's not in Africa, or to redefine Kushite as something other than Ethiopian, or well, not even really Ethiopian in our modern sense, but uh, farther south along the Nile, I guess would be the way to say that. So can you talk a little bit about what affects those kinds of direct confrontations, which are a little bit oblique to our own daily experience of racism, especially in 2020, 2021. But do those kinds of things have value in combating the larger structures of racism that we are embedded in every day?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there really is a lot going on there, that question for sure. Uh, Absolutely fundamentally agree that we have this possibility in biblical studies because of the diversity of text that we have available to us, the diversity of sort of bias that's clear in the text that we can show to our students. We have this opportunity to say, so, you know, what are we seeing here? What kinds of biases are behind this speech or this, you know, derogatory portrayal? Giving our students the tools to identify implicit bias when they see it, right? Giving our students the tools to respond to things that may devalue or derogate, that we really do have this opportunity because we can go to the text and say, hey, look, what's going on here? What do you think is really happening here, right? That can be very valuable in helping them then transfer that skill, right, to contemporary understandings of bias. Although certainly the ways that we racialize in 20th century America and in the United States is very different, right? In a lot of ways, it still has. We can still ask the students to ask those questions, and I think that as a guild, that we need to be doing that interrogating of ourselves, and I hope that's what the presentation helped with a little bit, because those questions weren't questions for our students, right? They were questions for ourselves that we need to be asking, like, in what ways am I whitewashing? In what ways am I centering whiteness in my own teaching practice? And I think those questions could be equally applicable to our scholarship. This requires a great deal of reflection from our colleagues and ourselves, and I recognize that is challenging and difficult, especially since this particular system that centers whiteness and white supremacy has been so beneficial to so many of us, right? We succeeded. We got our PhDs, we got good jobs, all those kinds of things, may make us not want to see how we were the benefactors of whiteness and white supremacy. And so I recognize that that's a difficult thing. But those questions that I think I posed on the slides could be equally valuable to the ways that we think about our scholarship and our scholarly community as well.
Well, thank you very, very much, Dr. Tinklenberg, for your paper. Thanks to our chairs for inviting this wonderful paper, and thanks to you all for tuning in. We hope you'll tune in for some further installments as this most unusual but kind of exciting SBL Pac Coast regional meeting this year rolls on. So until then, take good care, everyone.